Welcome to Better Than Gossip. I'm Kristen Coffield, your host today, and we're going to be talking with a personal friend of mine and an amazing human, Andrea Schmidt. She is the co-owner of Misha's Coffee. She's also the co-owner of Trident Athletics, and she holds multiple, I think it's 4, maybe 6, IWF Women's Masters weightlifting titles. So join me in welcoming Andrea today, and we're going to be talking about Coffee 101. Did you know about that?
What? I didn't hear. You know, that thing I've been telling you about. It's been a game changer for me.
Andrea, welcome back to Better Than Gossip. We are excited. This is really going to be a fun show today because people don't know a lot about where their coffee comes from or how it gets from where it's grown right into their cup. So thank you, first of all, for bringing this delicious coffee. We are really enjoying. It is the Route 66.
Yeah, your favorite.
My favorite. So we're going to talk about Coffee 101, and we're going to educate people a little bit about where the beans come from and why it's so important to know where your coffee comes from. And what is this?
That is actually a burlap sack that was full of coffee, and that is actually how coffee is shipped and stored.
So coffee comes in these bags, and what is the writing on the bag?
It's going to say typically where it's from, the grade, this SHB, that's strictly hard bean. That's a grade that's specific to Central America, Costa Rica. This is the actual plantation that it's from, and yeah, those are the information that's on it.
It's really cool because when you're in the coffee shop, when you're at Misha's, you can see all the bags stacked up in the back of the shop, and some of them are really elaborate and beautiful. And this is a food grade burlap, and then usually the beans are in something else inside of this, right?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. In the past, it was just in burlap.
Okay.
And then now they will often, not all of the time, but often be in a plastic bag as well that has a specific name they're tied in. Mainly that is because get cut and you lose coffee.
You could lose beans. And these are the little guys that come. The beans are actually green when you get them, right? Yep. And then you roast them, and the beans can be different sizes depending on where they're from and what type of bean they are. So this is Coffee 101. What is it people need to know, starting with where the coffee is grown?
Oh, sure. Interesting fact is that coffee was believed to be discovered in Ethiopia, and by the 15th century it was being actually cultivated in Yemen, and Dutch traders are who actually popularized coffee throughout the world. So that's an interesting fact. And that coffee was Arabica, which is what the specialty coffee rage was basically based on starting in the 60s. Arabica is coffee grown at high altitudes. It's grown in what we call the coffee belt. It's the equatorial tropics between Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. And that part of the world, it provides like the best climate and other conditions for growing Arabica, because Arabica has to be at these high altitudes. Another species of coffee that was cultivated later is called Robusta. Robusta is what's grown at low altitudes for maximum crop yield. I believe about 60% of the world's Robusta is grown in Vietnam, actually. A good amount, I could have that backwards with Brazil. Brazil and Vietnam are producing a lot. There is some in Africa. Robusta has twice the caffeine of Arabica. Most people don't know that. That's why you can get kind of jittery if you're leaving a diner, drinking cup after cup of like a Maxwell House type coffee. Yeah. It also doesn't have as much of the natural sugars or cholesterol that is going to help with the flavor profile of Arabica. So Robusta is typically described as more bitter. Not as flavorful.
Right. We've all had one of those, oh my God, I need a cup of coffee. And you stop at like some gas station and you get a cup of coffee and then you're like, that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
And there's So would Robusto be the coffee that's in a lot of the coffee drinks that people are buying?
Yes, and you like the prepackaged
Hard
one?
to know,
Absolutely. Right? A lot of times people are mixing Robusta with Arabica to keep the cost down. Actually, a little known fact is most commercial espresso blends have a percentage of Robusta. And the reason for that is the crema that is on the top of an espresso is produced much more easily with Robusta than Arabica. Okay. So if someone does not say they are selling 100% Arabica, there's a good chance that they are mixing in Robusta. Also, it's lately become popular to see like a high caffeine blend. Have you seen those?
Right.
That's really just like they're getting Robusta. And
interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So what to me is fascinating about coffee, and I think important in a 101, is to understand that the amount of steps and the actual physical labor and care that goes into a single coffee bush is so extreme that to me it's actually shocking that it doesn't cost like 100 times more than it does, knowing what goes into it. Even just a seedling, it takes 3 years for a seedling to even produce cherries. So that's just, and all seedlings will not produce cherries because cultivating coffee is hard. It's not an easy plant to grow. Another reason it's on in the equatorial tropics is it can survive some colder temperatures, but one frost, an entire crop will be destroyed. And that still happens, especially with kind of the way the world has been going climate-wise. More and more of that happens.
So it's a lot like wine in that regard.
Yes.
The first year you don't necessarily produce grapes. There's a whole process for these plants to thrive and then produce the cherry, the fruit, and then there's all these other steps.
Oh yeah,
after that.
One small step is the growing of the fruit. Then the fruit for Arabica, the majority of the Arabica is going to be grown high in the mountains, so it has to be hand-picked. Also, the cherries don't all ripen at the same time, so just like any fruit tree, you can't just like shake it, get everything. So they're hand-picked. So you have human beings out there in the hot sun picking each cherry. That is only one process. Once the cherries are picked, the actual coffee, these little seeds, most strains of coffee will be 2 of these little seeds together is like the pit of a cherry, essentially. There's also something called a pea berry. It's an agricultural strain where those 2 are fused together. But what you are trying to get to is inside the fruit. So what happens when someone picks that fruit? Well, there are 4 different processes for processing coffee. And one is called a wet process. That is where essentially the cherries are all soaked in water.
It's like a bath.
Yeah, it is. It's like a big bath. It is. It's a big bath for the coffee cherries. And any unripe or bad ones will float to the top, so that separates. And then the fruit and everything coating the bean is washed off. It's not done there though, but that's the first step. There's also what's called a natural or dry process where the cherry is just dried in the sun. Then what happens is when it's dried and removed, there's a little bit of the mucilage stays on the bean. So you can kind of see that difference on the green coffees. That gives a different flavor. Those coffees roast differently as well because there is like the moisture content is different. The other process is the honey process, which is where you leave some of the fruit on for a longer time, and then that's going to break down and affect the flavor more. The last and final process is unique to Sumatra and Sulawesi or Celebes.
I love that Sulawesi. Yeah. That's one of my favorite coffee beans.
It's a really interesting process where they do like a wet dry together. It's not used in most of the world. It's actually challenging to prevent mold in that process. But it creates, the parchment kind of stays on. It creates a very full-bodied coffee in the mouth. So the processing, in addition to the growing, what affects the flavor in the growing is going to be the terroir, the climate, the soil, the like conditions of the soil. Like that's why the flavor will change from year to year a little bit too. But then the processing very much affects how the coffee is going to taste. Then once it's processed, it has to actually be dried and the parchment removed. So that's like a whole
and that's
another
before
process.
it even gets in this bag. These are all the steps that we don't realize go into that great cup of coffee, and why coffee can be expensive, and why we might want to invest in a better cup of coffee, kind of that quality over quantity, enjoying that perfect cup. So we're going to take a little coffee break, and we'll be right back with more interesting coffee talk with Andrea Schmidt.
Hi, my name's Heather. I'm a mother of 2, and I'm also a morning TV reporter, so I get up at 3:30 in the morning, and I love coffee. I started putting Bub's MCT powder in my coffee as a dairy alternative, and I love the flavor, and I love how it makes me feel. Basically, it helps me maintain energy levels throughout the entire morning, and then moving into my day when I go home to my kiddos, it's still helping. It helps with my cognitive alertness so that I can talk well on TV after I've woken up so early in the morning, and it makes me feel good so I don't have the caffeine jitters.
Welcome back. That was really fun, what we talked about before, talking about, how many steps there are to get the coffee from the bush to the bag.
That's crazy.
And now we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens after you get these beans, but why you choose the beans you choose, because you're very particular about the beans that you select for Misha's coffee. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you choose the beans you choose?
Oh, absolutely. It makes it kind of easy because typically when you're selecting like the finest green coffee in the world, it is typically going to be the most sustainably produced and organic by default, and taste the best. There's a bunch of reasons for that. An interesting fact about coffee growing that most people don't know is that 70% of the world's Arabica coffee is grown by farmers with less than 5 acres. So like this coffee is coming from these little tiny farms. It's the complete opposite of like big agriculture for most of our foods. What happens in some countries is it's pretty cool because these farmers form a co-op. So they will pull together all of their grade of coffee, and then they share in the burden of processing. And so, for instance, Kenya is a country where they do that, and the coffee is incredible. It's delicious. It's super high quality. It does not mean that it's low quality if it's from a co-op and not a single estate. Single origin or estate, they're also called fincas, that will be one single farmer producing a lot of coffee. They're often more expensive. Those farmers do not benefit from fair trade policies. A lot of people are interested in fair trade.
And just tell people, what is fair trade coffee?
Fair Trade is an organization that started basically to set a higher price, to come in and help teach farmers and make sure coffee growers were getting a fair price. And while it can be really helpful, most of the single estates are getting way more than the fair trade price.
Okay.
So it was helpful in a way, but you don't need to insist on fair trade. If you're getting from a small farmer, they're actually getting more money. The fair trade organization also has to support itself. So, there's some money going to that as well. But it has overall been helpful for the industry, but I wouldn't say that's a must for purchasing.
It's kind of like organic, because, sometimes I'll go to my local farmer's market and I'll buy from a small independent farmer, and they may not be organic, but I have spoken to them and they use very low pesticides. They do a lot of sustainable practices. It's just too expensive for them to get the organic certification. So what you're saying is single estate, small growers
or co-op
can
from
be,
that's really high-end coffee. So higher grade coffee is graded. It's graded agriculturally. It's also graded by the SCA for like flavor profile. But the agricultural grade is based on size and weight. and the coffee cannot grow properly. For instance, if it's not shade grown, if they cut down the foliage so there's more direct sun, and it's for the coffee to grow faster, it won't grow big enough.
Okay.
So you can easily know that you're getting shade grown coffee if you are getting the absolute best hand-picked, highest grade Arabica coffee. So those things work nice. And your analogy was perfect for organic food, because coffee is very similar. When people hear that coffee is a highly sprayed crop, that is referring to Robusta. Arabica is not highly sprayed at all. Most farmers cannot afford any chemical fertilizers. They typically just use the cherries from the previous harvest, which are high in nitrogen, as fertilizer. They just simply can't afford the chemicals.
Right.
They live in these areas. They can't afford to have runoff going into their drinking water. So again, it just naturally happens that these coffees are organic by default for the most part.
We are going to take a quick break, and we're going to take a look at Andrea at Misha's roasting some coffee.
This is my coffee roaster. It is a 12 kilo roaster, so that's about 26 pounds we can roast at a time. So we roast artisanally still, which means that a lot of machines for places are much bigger. So I kind of compare like commercial bread in a commercial bakery to artisanal bread, like a small baker that's actually handling all of the loaves. And there's a little more variance typically when things are artisanal, which requires more experience to create consistency. But I believe that when things are artisanal, the potential for quality ends up being much higher, because you don't bring the quality down for consistency. You actually you take more of the art in addition to the science to create a more unique product and to really elevate the product to me, like, hey, what is the best that this coffee can possibly be? How can I connect with this coffee and roast it in the way that most perfectly expresses its qualities?
Well, welcome back. It's always fun to talk about our favorite morning beverage. And I have a really specific question, because I don't understand this part. When you get these different beans, where they come from different parts of the world, and then how do you decide which beans get a light roast or which beans get a dark roast? And tell us a little bit more about your process.
Oh, that's a great question. So we have coffee from all over the world. We have coffee from Central and South America, from Indonesia, Africa. We actually carry coffee from Yemen, which is very unique. It's a very small crop. It's extremely expensive, very difficult to get, but we have carried it since we opened because it's
Yemen is a war-torn country.
Yes,
so
there were 2 years where we couldn't even get it. It was very sad because they could not get their coffee to port. But I actually just secured more. I just found out the other day. So we will have it for the next year for sure. But like these different areas of the world, you can make some generalizations about coffees based on the area of the world. There are exceptions, but African coffees tend to be a little more on the acidic side when we talk of taste. They're like kind of a snappy quality, tangy. When we talk about body, when we're discussing coffee, it's like how it feels, the weight in the mouth. Indonesian coffees tend to be very low acid. Java is actually probably the least acidic coffee out there, but they have very heavy body. Central and South Americans in general have more balance, which is one reason I believe that they are so popular in this country.
So what would be some of those?
So El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, what else do we have? Honduras.
You gave me a really good coffee from Mexico.
Yep, Mexico. They have nice coffee in Mexico. It's interesting. I wasn't a fan of Mexican coffee 30 years ago. I just didn't, it wasn't as good. It's gotten much better, and now it's very good. So selecting coffees will be based on, we like to have coffees from all over the world. I rely heavily on my importer broker. His job is to actually, every year he travels to all of these places. He tastes the coffee in country. He inspects the areas. He says, hey, are they actually growing sustainably like they say? Because it's across the world. People can say whatever they
right.
want. So that's his job. He'll also let me know, hey, this crop's not great this year. There were a couple years where I did not even carry Brazil because it was there had been a frost. For a few years after that, the coffee just wasn't like up to par. So I rely heavily on him for that. As far as the roasts, that can be dependent on a lot of things. It's like the altitude and the moisture content in the coffee can kind of dictate whether you want a lighter or a darker roast. I've always been a little bit rebellious, so I like to flip things on their side a little. And for instance, Mocha Java, traditionally a blend of Yemen and Java, has traditionally always been roasted very light. And we started our Mocha Java with a French roast, and it is spectacular and one of our best sellers. Very unique. I think it's very suited to a dark roast. It's a lot. That's where some of the art comes in, and that's where being a small roaster and roasting in small batches is really fun. Because if I make a mistake or I think, hey, I don't love this, I can go
It's
back.
a special.
Yeah, I'll switch that up.
So, Andrea, you've been roasting for 30 years.
Yes.
So, Andrea's been roasting coffee for 30 years. And one of the exciting things about that is, just like you said, you can get a little more creative. There's no guidebook that says this bean has to be roasted this way.
No.
It's really up to you as the roaster to make that determination. Do you ever get beans that maybe are from someplace where, maybe it's Tanzania, peaberry, and do you ever get the beans and you look at them and you're like, I'm going to have to roast these medium,
It would usually be I'll taste it first. And
Okay.
typically if you're tasting a coffee or cupping, you will always roast it light, because dark roasts, this is actually an interesting fact, the darker you roast, you will temper the acidity, which a lot of people think a dark roast is more acidic. It is not. It tempers the acidity. It also is going to obscure some of the more subtle flavor nuances, right? That taste of the dark roast that a lot of people like overtakes a lot of the small nuances. So if you're cupping it to discover a coffee, you should always roast it lighter. That being said, I think it's very much personal taste. It's just like wine. Some people who drink red wine prefer a Cabernet. Some people prefer a Pinot Noir. It's just a matter of taste. I don't actually believe that one is superior. And your palate can change over time.
Right.
You know?
Right, that's true. I used to be a Mocha Java girl, and now I think Bill buys Tanzania peaberry. So, and that's really good. The secret sauce is the favorite part of the show for me, because I usually learn something or I correct something I've been doing wrong. Andrea, what is your secret sauce today?
The secret sauce is that if you are buying from a small local roaster and your coffee is very fresh, you do not need to put it anywhere but in a bag on your counter. Hard to believe, but it is true. If you are going to keep coffee for a long time, you can freeze it. Do not put coffee in the refrigerator. You want to avoid condensation. So additional moisture is going to degrade it more quickly. If you are very serious about how you brew your coffee, if you do put it in the freezer, you should bring it to room temperature before you brew it. However, if you take your whole pound, freeze it, bring it to room temperature, freeze it, bring it to room temperature, you are building condensation, and that will actually degrade it more. So you should only take out what you need, let that come to room temperature, put the rest back in the freezer.
So here's a quick question too. So there's there's 3 ways to buy coffee. You can go into a coffee shop and get yourself a cup. You can buy grounds, or you can buy whole bean. And we have a bean grinder, a burr grinder. It had to be, my husband was very particular. And it really just depends, I guess, on what your coffee maker is at home. But are there benefits really to grinding your own beans? I'm just curious.
It is technically fresher.
Okay.
So anyone that is a real purist is going to tell you absolutely buy your coffee whole bean and grind it at home. For me personally, I'm very practical, and I know that I don't necessarily want to wake up and grind coffee. I want it to be as easy to prepare in the morning as possible. Also, a grinder at a shop is going to be a much better grinder. So the quality of the grind, say at my shop, from an $8,000 grinder, it's going to be perfectly even, very nice. What I lose in freshness, I may be gaining in a better flavor from the grind being so good. But that would be maybe if you're only keeping the coffee for a week.
Okay, that's a great tip. And now I can tell Bill to get those beans out of the refrigerator. And we do have some frozen beans up, at our second home, because sometimes, there's beans left over at the end of the summer, and we do put them in the freezer. So it's good to know that that's acceptable. And when Bill goes out of town, I go to Misha's and get my coffee. But I could buy just a little bit of coffee at a time and make it in my screw top espresso machine too. And
absolutely.
That would really work. Andrea, it is such a joy to have you here explaining what we really don't understand about coffee and how many steps go into getting the beans to a coffee shop, why it's so important to buy locals, to support these small coffee houses that are either roasting their own beans or maybe buying their beans, but brewing a really great cup of coffee, and also aligning our consumer dollars with our values for what's better for the planet by making these sustainable choices, and also having some fun. So just before we wrap up today, can you explain the different what we're looking at here?
Sure. This is just showing you, this is the green coffee, so pre-roasting, and these are the 3 roasts that I do. This we would call a full city or a city plus. It's interesting in coffee, there isn't a specific language that has stayed throughout the industry, so what some people will call like a French roast might not be the same for others. So this will be my opinion and what they were calling 30 years ago. So this is, when you roast this lighter roast, I would call it like for people a medium roast. It's roasted dark enough that the oils are coming to the surface, and so those flavor compounds are going to be there. It's delicious. Coffees that are too light tend to be sharply acidic. I'm personally not a fan of that, so I like this as my lightest roast. This in the middle here is what we use for espresso. What's interesting about that is you can consider the brewing process a continuation of the cooking of the coffee. So processes like espresso, which are very quick, you want the coffee a little bit darker. If it's too light, it's still going to be very acidic. It's not going to continue cooking. Same with cold brew, because you're not having a hot water. It doesn't cook the coffee as much. So I like a slightly darker roast. But I don't necessarily want that taste of where it's really caramelized in the dark roast. A French roast is what we call our dark roast. That is, you can see it's very oily. A really good French roast, I believe, is hard to find these days because, things go in trends, and light roasting became very popular in like mid 2000s. And honestly, many roasters do not know how to do a dark roast anymore. Dark roasts are also more where you're prone to having a fire, or they're a little more challenging. So
there's that certain burnt quality that people talk about from certain coffees, and that would be potentially a dark roast that could have been done in a big high quantities,
or just incorrectly roasted, either too long, like kind of dry it out, or temperature too high, where like it's a very fine line of where you want it just dark enough where you've got that kind of toasty flavor, but you don't want it burnt.
It's a little like tequila, actually. You've got your Blanco, which is your lighter. You've got your Añejo, which has a little more toasty, and then you've even got like the darker.
No, it is. So the process is really interesting, and then you can there's a visible difference.
You can see it and smell it. So, Andrea Schmidt, thank you so much. It is so wonderful to hear what we don't know about coffee to help us make better choices. And we've got another fun segment coming up where we are going to brew the perfect cup of coffee, and that's going to be really fun. We're going to taste some different coffees, and we're going to be talking about coffee and wellness. And this is an area that a lot of people don't realize. There's been a lot of information about how coffee is good for our health, so we're going to really explore that a little bit more. Andrea, can you tell us where people can find you?
Yes, our website, www.mishascoffee.com. You can place an order there for fresh roasted small batch craft coffee. And for Better Than Gossip viewers, we have a special gift of a free half pound of coffee with any order.
And we will have that in your expert profile at Better Than Gossip, and we will tell the viewers, where they can access that code. And we have loved having you today at Better Than Gossip. I'm Kristen Coffield. Better Than Gossip, ageless advice for timeless women.